World History students, Miss Edelin speaking. Remember to have your note sheet out as you take notes, because that is what is due in class, and I would like it on note sheets. If you don't have one, print it out from Schoology folder of Ancient Greece right now before you begin. I would like you to recall the ancient peoples that became the Greeks later on, starting with the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, and the Dorians. And then we talked about the geography of Greece prior to this lesson. What we're going to focus on today is what were the unifying forces of these independent ancient Greek city-states? What held them together like glue? And one of the things was that every city-state had the name polis. That is the Greek word for city-state. We still use this root word in some of our words today. Think of where Superman worked is a metropolis. We have cities like Minneapolis and Annapolis. All Greek city-states also had a high part of the city because it was so dang mountainous there. And that high part was called the Acropolis. And that's usually where the temples were located and spiritual things took place up there. Also, all Greeks honored the same ancient heroes. And a good example of that would be Hercules. All ancient Greeks knew about Hercules. Greeks did participate in common festivals, such as the Olympics. You might put that as an example. They prayed to the same gods, and hence we know they were what? Polytheistic. So you might want to put that down. Zeus, Hera, everybody knew who those gods were. And the last thing is they did share the same language and felt superior to non-Greeks because of this uniting force. They called barbaroi people who did not speak Greek because they felt like they were just speaking nonsense. They were going bar 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 bar. You know how sometimes we make fun of people we cannot understand what they're saying, and the Greeks were that way. They were kind of snippy and looked down on people. I have a little diagram here that I got off the internet. This is the Acropolis of this, supposed city-state here. And down here is the marketplace, which would be the agora. Okay, do you see the term agora for marketplace? There you go. What we're going to talk about now is the development of governments that all Greek city-states went through. So every Greek city-state kind of went through this evolution. Okay, so we're going to talk about the period from 750, the end of the Dark Ages, to 500 BCE, and then basically the city-states will kind of split up and go different ways, but they basically all went through this initial evolution. And you probably know the first stage already, because whether it was China, India, Mesopotamia, or Egypt, every place we studied so far started with what form of government? You got it. They started with a monarchy, okay? And that's just a single ruler in power. Now, the Greek city-states over time, though, they're going to have these people at the top, these rich, noble landowners, who in the beginning, they defend the king and work with him, but eventually they want power for themselves, okay? And when they got it, it was known as an aristocracy, because you don't just have one person running the show. You have this government ruled by land-holding nobles, and they would put more than one person forward at a time. Eventually, you'll have wealthy merchants and farmers and artisans saying, hey, we want a piece of this power also. They're starting to make money. And when they start getting involved in the government, we have this business class that is part of the powerful elite. And the new term is oligarchy. Now, I had a student in the past. He said, how am I going to remember the difference between an oligarchy and aristocracy, because they're both rich people running the show? But then he said, oligarchy sounds like Olive Garden. And Olive Garden is a business, Miss Edelin, so that's how I remember it. All right, so you do what you need to do. It's just a little tip from Miss Edelin. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about Sparta and compare it to Athens, because Sparta and Athens are the two extremes. All the other city-states fall somewhere in between. They're a little bit like Sparta. They're a little bit like Athens. So let's look at how their governments and city-states developed. First of all, Sparta was located on the Peloponnesus Peninsula. In fact, Because they were so dominant in the Peloponnesus, Sparta is sometimes called the Peloponnesus. See, here's the word Peloponnese. This is the Peloponnese, and here is Sparta. The whole big peninsula hanging down is the Balkan, but this little bigger broken off part is the Peloponnesus, okay? In Sparta, all the boys are going to receive military training beginning around the age of 5 or 6, and it would last virtually their entire lives. Even after they married, they would eat in the barracks until age 30. Shoot me an email at edelinc@fatherryan.org and tell me why they had this policy of eating in the barracks even after they were married. Boys did not receive in Sparta a traditional school education. And if you were a citizen in Sparta, you were native-born males over the age of 30. Girls were raised to produce healthy sons for the army. They received a very limited education that would be the equivalent of a glorified PE today. They did march to music. But listen here, Spartan women were permitted to run their husband or father's estates while the men were away fighting, and they had the right to inherit property. Pretty big stuff in the ancient world. Rulers did form a military society, and when the original people that were in the Peloponnesus were conquered, they were turned into slaves called helots. Now that's going to be, we're going to have another H word, so you really need to lock down on this, helots, and just remember it's hell being a helot or a slave. Okay, and this was an institutionalized form of slavery. It's not like the slavery most of the ancient world had. If these people, it was like through their life, their children were born into slavery, their children's children were going to be slaves. They could never be free. This is almost like the caste system, so set in stone it was. Rulers of Sparta did forbid trade and travel. The arts are not going to flourish as a result in Sparta, and all resources went to the military. Let's change gears to Athens now. Athens is located on the Attica Peninsula, and let's look at this. Right here is the Attica Peninsula, and there's Athens. I know it says Athene. That's the Greek for Athens, okay? So it's not too far from Sparta. Now, boys will be receiving education around the age of 5 or 6, but only if they could afford it. And some boys would go on to a secondary education. Usually they all learned how to read, write, they learned music, poetry. They did get a really good physical education training. They wrestled and raced. They did all kinds of things like that. They weren't in the military at a young age, but they were physically trained. And that was important to any ancient Greek. You had to be tough to be a Greek. They did learn rhetoric, which was the art of speaking, because they thought their position in government was so important that they had to be able to be persuasive. They also learned logic, because by having good logic, you could convince people of your point of view. And of course, every Athenian male received military training for at least 1 year when they were 18. That was required. Now, women were considered inferior in Athens. They received a little to no education. Unless your parents were rich, just forget about it, okay? But if you were rich, you were secluded most of your life to just managing household activities. Even if you married, your husband might go out to the theater, but you were home. You didn't go out. And as was typical in most ancient societies, Athens did have a slave population, mostly formed by those who were in debt or captured in battle. Unlike Sparta, these individuals in Athens did not inherit the slave position from their parents. Rulers of Athens are going to encourage trade with other city-states, and arts are going to flourish because of the cultural diffusion. It will become a cultural center of all of Greece. Architecture, sculpture, theater, philosophy, historical writing, they're just a sampling of the developments that will come out of Athens. So let's look now at the government of Sparta, which is kind of a hodgepodge of things. First, we have the part that's like a monarchy. You have 2 kings heading up the Spartan government, one who's going to really focus on the military while the others dealt with domestic affairs, things going on in the city-state. Then they had a council of elders that was like an aristocracy, because these were old older, wealthy citizens. So they were males over the age of 60. There was 28 of them that sat like on a board, and their job was to propose laws and serve as a court. Now, right below them was the body, a legislative body known as the Assembly. And everybody else, all the male citizens over the age of 30, voted on whether to accept the Council of Elders laws, and they also had a second job where they elected 5 ephors who oversaw the work of the kings. Now, this is kind of a checks and balances. You see that they're supposed to oversee each other, but really this assembly was like a rubber stamp on the Council of Elders. Think about it. They're a militaristic society. If you're the lower body, are you going to really disagree with your elders above you? Probably not. So let's change gears to the Athenian government and realize that, in that evolution, Athens kind of got to the aristocracy stage and kind of stalled out there. They had a board of archons running the government. And what we're going to do in the next few slides is look at some significant reforms that caused Athens to evolve into a direct democracy. Please write this entire definition down. A direct democracy is a government in which citizens participate in the day-to-day affairs of the government rather than through elected officials. Okay? Now, email me whether you think the United States has a direct democracy. Argue your point for me in the email. That's edelinc@fatherryan.org. So let's look at some history here. In 621, we had this archon named Draco, and he said, hey, these guys aren't paying their debt. They are just going to get thrown into jail. So he started enslaving debtors. Now, recall that you cannot be a citizen of Athens if you are a slave, even if it's just because you went into debt. So in 594, here's our first significant, you want to put a little star by this, this is your first significant reform. A guy by the name of Solon is going to come along and say, hey, this is not good. Athens is having all these economic problems. The rich are getting rich, the poor are getting poor, and then they're getting slammed into jail. So we're losing all these citizens to becoming debtor slaves. This is not a good situation. So he repealed some of Draco's harsher laws, and the way you're going to remember his name is Solon freed the debtor slaves, but 2 S's there. And he also is going to form an assembly where ordinary citizens can be involved in the government. Okay, again, this is male citizens over the age of 30. They became members of the assembly, which makes them very proud. Now, in 546, things weren't getting better in Athens, so this tyrant by the name of Pisistratus rose up. Now, back in the day, tyrant did not have a negative connotation like it did today. It just meant someone who gained power by force. And by the way, Pisistratus was very popular. People wanted him to take over. They felt like the archons weren't getting the job done and they needed somebody to take control. And what his reform was, is he basically redistributed wealth. He gave land to the poor because the rich people were sitting on these huge estates and the poor needed a way to feed themselves and make a living. So he gave them land and they were able to do that. That kind of steadied things out. He also gave them more of a voice in the government. And then our next big reform was in 507 when a guy by the name of Cleisthenes, who broadened the role of the ordinary citizen by creating a council of 500. Now notice you've got the C for council, the C for Cleisthenes. And these people were chosen by lot, meaning they were randomly chosen. Anybody could sit on the council of 500. And it prepared laws for the assembly and supervised work of the government. You usually sat on the council for about 1 year. Very important move on his part because even poor people could make it onto this council. Although Athens had a direct democracy, it was called limited because not everybody is a part of it. The women, children, slaves, and foreign residents could not participate in the government. Only male citizens over the age of 30. And then here's the question again. Does the United States have a direct democracy? You could also tell me whether we have a limited democracy as well. That's the end of the show. I'll see you in class. Happy day.